With the world building done, the horror ramps up as Lovecraft brings his strange mythic creatures into play. In part 13, the horrors get worse as the remains of Gedney and a dog are found. If you want to hear more, please click like, subscribing, clicking the bell, then all will let you know when a new episode releases. Let us know what you liked and what you want to see more of in the comments. You can even join us on Patreon. For now though, it's time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. As we stepped out into the awesome half daylight of this monstrous cylinder bottom, 50 million years old, and without doubt the most primarily ancient structure ever to meet our eyes, we saw that the ramp traversed sides, stretched dizzily up to a height of fully 60 feet. This, we recalled from our aerial survey, meant an outside glaciation of some 40 feet, since the yawning gulf we had seen from the plane had been at the top of an approximately 20-foot mound of crumbled masonry, somewhat sheltered for 3/4 of its circumference by the massive curving walls of a line of higher ruins. According to the sculptures, the original tower had stood in the centre of an immense circular plaza and had been perhaps 500 or 600 feet high, with tiers of horizontal discs near the top and rows of needle-like spires along the upper rim. Most of the masonry had obviously toppled outward rather than inward, a fortunate happening, since otherwise the ramp might have been shattered and the whole interior choked. As it was, the ramp showed sad battering, whilst the choking was such that all the archways seemed to have been half cleared. It only took us a moment to conclude that this was indeed the route by which those others had descended, and that this would be the logical route for our own ascent, despite the long trail of paper we had left elsewhere. The tower's mouth was no further from the foothills and our waiting plane than was the great terraced building we had entered, and any further subglacial exploration we might make on this trip would lie in this general region. Oddly, we were still thinking about possible later trips, even after all we had seen and guessed. Then, as we picked our way cautiously over the debris of the great floor, there came a sight which, for the time, excluded all other matters. It was the neatly huddled array of 3 sledges in that farther angle of the ramp's lower and outward projecting course, which had hitherto been screened from our view. There they were, the 3 sledges missing from Lake's camp, shaken by a hard usage which must have included forcible dragging along great reaches of snowless masonry and debris, as well as much hand porterage over utterly unnavigable places. They were carefully and intelligently packed and strapped, and contained things memorably familiar enough: the gasoline stove, fuel cans, instrument cases, provision tins, tarpaulins, obviously bulging with books, and some bulging with less obvious contents. Everything derived from Lake's equipment. After what we had found in that other room, we were in a measure prepared for this encounter. The really great shock came when we stepped over and undid one tarpaulin whose outlines had particularly disquieted us. It seems that others as well as Lake had been interested in collecting typical specimens, for there were two here, both stiffly frozen, perfectly preserved, patched with adhesive plaster where some wounds around the neck had occurred, and wrapped with care to prevent further damage. They were the bodies of young Gedney and the missing dog. Many people will probably judge us as callous as well as mad for thinking about the Northwood Tunnel and the abyss so soon after our sombre discovery. And I am not prepared to say that we would have immediately revived such thoughts but for specific circumstance which broke upon us and set up a whole new train of speculations. We had replaced the tarpaulin over poor Gedney and were standing in a kind of mute bewilderment when the sounds finally reached our consciousness. The first sounds we had heard since descending out of the open, where the mountain wind had whined faintly from its unearthly heights. Well known and mundane though they were, the presence in this remote world of death was more unexpected and unnerving than any grotesque or fabulous tones could possibly have been, since they gave a fresh upsetting to all our notions of cosmic harmony. It had been some trace of that bizarre musical piping over a wide range, which Lake's dissection report had led us to expect in those others, and which indeed our overwrought fancies had been reading into every wind howl we had heard since coming on the camp horror. It would have been a kind of hellish congruity with the eon dead region around us. A voice from other epochs belongs in a graveyard of other epochs. As it was, however, the noise shattered all our profoundly seated adjustments. Out of all tacit acceptance of the inner Antarctic as a waste utterly and irrevocably void of every vestige of normal life. What we heard was not the fabulous note of any buried blasphemy of Elder Earth, from whose supernatural toughness an age-denied polar sun had evoked a monstrous response. Instead, it was a thing so mockingly normal and so unerringly familiarised by our sea days off Victoria Land and our camp days at McMurdo Sound that we shuddered to think of it here, where such things ought not to be. To be brief, it was simply the raucous squawking of a penguin. The muffled sound floated from sub-glacial recesses nearly opposite to the corridor whence we had come, regions manifestly in the direction of that other tunnel to the vast abyss. The presence of a living water bird in such a direction, in a void whose surface was one of age-long and uniform lifelessness, could lead to only one conclusion. Hence, our first thought was to verify the objective reality of the sound. It was indeed repeated, and seemed at times to come from more than one throat. Seeking its source, we entered an archway from which much debris had been cleared, resuming our trailblazing with an added paper supply taken with curious repugnance from one of the tarpaulin bundles on the sledges. When we left daylight behind, as the glaciated floor gave place to a litter of detritus, we plainly discerned some curious dragging tracks, and once Danforth found a distinct print of a sort whose description would be only too superfluous. This, of course, indicated by the penguin cries, was precisely what our map and compass prescribed as an approach to the more northerly tunnel mouth, and we were glad to find that a bridgeless thoroughfare on the ground and basement levels seemed open. The tunnel, according to the chart, ought to start from the basement of a large pyramidal structure, which we seemed to vaguely recall from our aerial survey as remarkably well preserved. Along our path, the single torch showed a customary profusion of carvings, but we did not pause to examine any of these. Suddenly, a bulky white shape loomed up ahead of us, and we flashed on the second torch. It is odd how wholly this new quest had turned our minds from earlier fears of what might lurk near. Those other ones, having left their supplies in the great circular place, must have planned to return after their scouting trip toward or into the abyss. Yet we had now discarded all caution concerning them as completely as if they had never existed. This white, waddling thing was fully 6 feet high, yet we seemed to realize at once that it was not one of those others. They were larger and dark, and according to the sculptures, their motion over land surface was a swift, assured matter, despite the queerness of their seaborne technical movement. But to say the white thing did not profoundly frighten us would be vain. We were indeed clutched for an instant by a primitive dread, almost sharper than the worst of our reasoned fears regarding those others. There came a flash of anticlimax as the white shape slid into a lateral archway to our left to join 2 others of its kind, which had summoned it in raucous tones. For it was only a penguin, albeit of a huge, unknown species, larger than the greatest of the known king penguins, and monstrous in its combined albinism and virtual eyelessness. When we had followed the thing into the archway and turned both our torches on the indifferent and unheeding group of 3, we saw that they were all eyeless albinos of the same unknown and gigantic species. Their size reminded us of some of the archaic penguins depicted in the Old One sculptures, and it did not take us long to conclude that they were descended from the same stock. Undoubtedly surviving through a retreat to some warmer inner region whose perpetual blackness had destroyed their pigmentation and atrophied their eyes to mere useless slits. That their present habitat was the vast abyss we sought was not for a moment to be doubted, and this evidence of the gulf's continued warmth and habitability filled us with the most curious and subtly perturbing fancies. We wondered too what had caused these 3 birds to venture out of their usual domain. The state and silence of the great dead city made it clear that it had at no time been a habitual and seasonal rookery, whilst the manifest indifference of the trio to our presence made it seem odd that any passing party of those others should have startled them. Was it possible that those others had taken some aggressive notion or tried to increase their meat supply? We doubted whether that pungent odour which the dogs had hated could cause an equal antipathy in these penguins, since their ancestors had obviously lived on excellent terms with the old ones, an amicable relationship which must have survived in the abyss below as long as any of the old ones remained. Regretting, in a flare-up of the old spirit of pure science, that we could not photograph these anomalous creatures, we shortly left them to their squawking and pushed on towards the abyss, whose openness was now so positively proved to us, and whose exact direction occasional penguin tracks made clear. Not long afterwards, a steep descent in a long, low, doorless and peculiarly sculptureless corridor led us to believe that we were approaching the tunnel mouth at last. We had passed 2 more penguins. Then the corridor ended in a prodigious open space which made us gasp involuntarily. A perfect inverted hemisphere, obviously deep underground, fully 100 feet in diameter and 50 feet high, with low archways opening around all parts of the circumference, but one, and that one yawning cavernously with a black arched aperture which broke the symmetry of the vault to a height of nearly 15 feet. It was the entrance to the great abyss. In this vast hemisphere, whose concave roof was impressively, though decadently carved to a likeness of the primordial celestial dome, a few albino penguins waddled, alien there, but indifferent and unseeing. The black tunnel yawned indefinitely off at a steep descending grade, its aperture adorned with grotesquely chiselled jambs and lintel. From that cryptical mouth we fancied a current of slightly warmer air, and perhaps a suspicion of vapour proceeded, and we wondered what living entities other than penguins, the limitless void below, and the contiguous honeycombings of the land and the Titan mountains might conceal. We wondered too whether the trace of mountaintop smoke, at first suspected by Poor Lake, as well as the odd haze we had ourselves perceived around the rampart-crowned peak, might not be caused by the tortuous channeled rising of some such vapour from the unfathomed regions of the Earth's core. Entering the tunnel, we saw that its outline was, at least at the start, about 15 feet each way, sides, floor and arched roof composed of the usual megalithic masonry. The sides were sparsely decorated with cartouches of conventional designs in a latter decadent style, and all the construction and carving were marvellously well preserved. The floor was quite clear, except for a slight detritus bearing outgoing penguin tracks and the inward tracks of those others. The further one advanced, the warmer it became, so that we were soon unbuttoning our heavy garments. We wondered whether there were any actually igneous manifestations below, and whether the waters of that sunless sea were hot. After a short distance, the masonry gave place to solid rock, though the tunnel kept the same proportions and presented the same aspect of carved regularity. Occasionally, its varying grade became so steep that grooves were cut into the floor. Several times we noticed that the mouths of small lateral galleries were not recorded in our diagrams, none of them such as to complicate the problem of our return, and all of them welcome as possible refuges in case we met unwelcome entities on their way back from the abyss. The nameless scent of such things was very distinct. Doubtless, it was suicidally foolish to venture into that tunnel under the known conditions, but the law of the unplumbed is stronger in certain persons than most suspect. Indeed, it was just such a law which had brought us to this unearthly polar waste in the first place. We saw several penguins as we passed along, and speculated on the distance we would have to traverse. The carvings had led us to expect a steep downhill walk of about a mile to the abyss, but our previous wanderings had shown us that matters of scale were not wholly to be depended on. After about a quarter of a mile, that nameless scent had become greatly accentuated, and we kept careful track of the various lateral openings we passed. There was no visible vapour as at the mouth, but this was doubtless due to the lack of contrasting cooler air. The temperature was rapidly ascending, and we were not surprised to come up across a careless heap of material, shudderingly familiar to us. It was composed of furs and tent cloths taken from Lake's camp, and we did not pause to study the bizarre forms into which the fabrics had been slashed. Slightly beyond this point, we noticed a decided increase in the size and number of the side galleries, and concluded that the density of the honeycombed region beneath the higher foothills must now have been reached. The nameless scent was now curiously mixed with another and scarcely less offensive odour, of what nature we could not guess, though we thought of decaying organisms and perhaps unknown subterranean fungi. Then came a startling expansion of the tunnel for which the carvings had not prepared us, a broadening and rising into a lofty, natural-looking elliptical cavern with a level floor, some 75 feet long and 50 broad, and with many immense side passages leading away into cryptical darkness. So ends part 13 of At the Mountains of Madness. They have found remains from their party and giant living creatures, yet still the explorers continue. In part 14, the horrors go greater when they find the remains of the old ones, recently decapitated and covered in black slime. If you enjoyed the tale, it helps us if you let others know, so please click the like button and share with others that may be interested. Subscribing will let you travel with us on further adventures of the dark and terrible, with the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our Eldritch Order on Discord, come visit us on Patreon. Then you can join in the discussions and even help guide the choice of stories. See the description for details of the Patreon and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about modern board games where you can create your own dark and terrible stories. Until next time, farewell. And be gentle, as just because a creature is scary does not mean it wants to hurt you. But of course, that doesn't mean it won't.